You are seeing cities around the country right now where the crime is worse than it was during the crack epidemic. We have underinvested in our criminal justice system for too long. My name is Reihan Salam, and this is my story. I'm the president of the Manhattan Institute, a think tank based in New York City. I'm a lifelong Brooklynite, and I am an American. My parents are immigrants from what is now Bangladesh. They moved to Brooklyn in 1976. When my parents first came to the United States, they had a very classic immigrant experience. My father was a professor in his native country. They had a real sense of pride about where they came from, the traditions they were a part of. At the same time, they were people who really embraced being in a new place. They were excited to be in New York City, to be in the United States. I think they really instilled in me that sense that you can be in every room as long as you do the work, as long as you are thoughtful and conscientious and kind. You have a right to build something, to create something, to make something of yourself. I'm immensely grateful to them for that. I grew up in a milieu that was diverse, but people weren't talking about diversity constantly. It was actual diversity. It wasn't just about skin color. It was about specific traditions, specific people who lived in specific ways, all of whom were bought in on this country. Patriotism was just very present. It was just in the background. It was in the air. A lot of kids whose parents were from the former Soviet Union, from elsewhere in Asia, from Latin America, from the Caribbean. The folks who were native-born Americans were themselves typically people who were second or third generation. I didn't really feel as though I was defined or limited or constrained by my ethnic background. The thing that's really unique and unusual and incredible about this country is that it actually gives people the opportunity to build and organize and to create great things. A lot of my political thinking emerged in high school. I thought of myself as a liberal, but I thought of myself as a tough-minded liberal. I was someone who really believed in the promise and potential of my country, and I was very, very patriotic. My parents never tried to direct me to think one thing or another, but they did want me to have reasoning. You know, they did want me to have some backbone. They did want me to have some argument that was coherent, that wasn't relying on authority. I went to Cornell for 1 year, and then I transferred to Harvard as a sophomore. I feel very lucky that I got to go. I started thinking of myself as a conservative a bit later in college. Well, I was an eccentric liberal. I was a heterodox liberal. And then it was finally, I'm just a conservative. I was eventually stretching the definition of being a liberal to a point where the liberal folks on campus didn't recognize me as one of them. And I found that I had much more in common with my conservative classmates. There are a lot of folks in cities like New York and San Francisco who are saying, I know for a fact that there's a crime problem. And that becomes the little entry point. There's almost kind of this gateway drug. There's one area where they have a solid foundation, and it leads them to question everything else around it. Because, well, then wait a second. If this thing that I am confident is true, then, suddenly, well, what are all these other things that I'm being bullied into agreeing with? I'm very concerned about the ideological climate in higher education. When I was in college, Harvard was definitely a place that was decidedly left of center, but there was some diversity around the edges. My sense now from talking to a lot of students on campus at Harvard, but also elsewhere, the climate is much more hostile to dissenting ideas. In many cases, you have universities that exist to serve themselves. They exist to serve their employees. They exist to serve not just their faculty, but this bureaucracy that oftentimes has this very sharp ideological perspective. So I really think this is a moment for Americans to think long and hard about what are we as taxpayers, as citizens, getting out of these institutions. I grew up in New York City at the height of the crack epidemic. It really felt like New York City was emptying out. Everyone who could was moving to the suburbs. And my parents made a very deliberate decision. They wanted to stay. But the big downside and the big reason so many of their friends were leaving was because of crime. I remember my father, this incident where he was mugged and he was thrown to the ground. His glasses broke. There was another incident when I was in elementary school. I was a latchkey kid, like a lot of kids in my generation. Came home and our VCR was stolen. And I called my father to tell him. He told me, let's not mention it. Let's buy a new one and replace it. There was no sense in calling the police. Why bother doing that? It was something that really stayed with me. I actually remember coming home one summer. It was after my freshman year. I was walking down the street and there was someone who was a little suspicious, and I actually did start speeding up to get back home. But then the person got behind me, held me at knife point, and then just stole what I had. It was right in front of my door where my parents lived. Got inside and I called the police. This was a big deal because, there was a time when I was younger where you wouldn't bother doing that. But I called the police. They got there incredibly fast. I got in the car. They drove me around. They listened to me. They cared about what happened. And I felt much safer. That was a huge part of my education, my political education, my moral education. Feeling safe is the foundation of freedom. It's the foundation of everything else. In the space of, 2-3 years, we've given up a decade and a half of gains that we've made in the fight against crime. You are seeing cities around the country right now where the crime is worse than it was during the crack epidemic. We can't let that happen. One thing that is so extraordinary about the past couple of years is that you've seen this incredible increase in crime, and yet you have people who continue to deny reality. When you tell chronic, violent, repeat offenders that the cost of being an offender is going to go down, and the cost of apprehending that offender, of prosecuting that offender, is going to go up, that guess what? It's open season. One thing I've observed in my life is that when you have safe streets, you have community. You have people build relationships with strangers. You see people go beyond their group. When you have violence, people retreat. They look on their neighbors with suspicion. They don't look on them as potential friends or business partners. That's the terrible irony of this. If you care about civic harmony, if you care about integration, if you care about people building relationships, if you care about diversity and inclusion, the bedrock of that has to be people feeling safe. They have to feel as though if someone is a danger to their neighborhood, to their community, to their family, that person is going to be dealt with appropriately. It is urgently important that we get the crime problem under control. If you do not get that right, nothing else matters. And there's a playbook for it. We have to address the recruitment and retention crisis in police departments around the country. And we need a cultural message that if you are protecting public safety, you are putting yourself in danger, that is something that should be celebrated and praised. Then we've got to get the laws right. If you're dealing with someone who is a dangerous, chronic offender, that person should most likely be detained. If you are letting people go who are chronic, violent offenders, you are incarcerating too few people. The thing that frustrates me most, you have people who say, oh, but it's so expensive to imprison people. It's so expensive. You want to know what's expensive? People dying? What's expensive is people abandoning cities. That's what's expensive. And we have underinvested in our criminal justice system for too long. America is an immensely successful, multi-ethnic, constitutional republic that's undergirded by time-tested values, a commitment to economic freedom and opportunity, to law and order. This is a place that continues to be an incredible magnet for talent from around the world, and I just don't want to see it squandered. We haven't lost it all yet, but there is the sense that we're going in the wrong direction. So what I want people to do is to really look deep in their hearts and think about the kind of future they want for their children, the kind of society they want to be a part of, the kind of society they want to build. And I would bet that the vast majority of people, whatever ideological partisan label they have attached to their names, what they're going to want is a society in which children are not bound by color or ethnic origin. These are things that are categories created by some census bureaucrat. Don't let that dominate your life. Don't let that define who you are. Thank you for watching this video. To keep these videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible gift to PragerU.